Hey everyone, Toonstar here, and I'm here to introduce you to a new segment called My Commander. And what this segment will be a breakdown of the various commander decks I've made for Magic the Gathering. I'm using this as a way to connect to other people who play the game, especially in these times when connection is so limited, and also to introduce people to the concept of Commander who haven't actually had a chance to try it. Um, None of what you'll see here is what you'll call winning strategies or top tier decking. What this is just breakdowns of the decks I've built, me sharing my strategies that work with them best, and uh, and you might see some cards in here that you agree with, some cards that you don't agree with, and other cards that you didn't even realize that you might want to put into this kind of deck. Um, you may even see decks that you never even thought of. Like I said, these are not top tier decks. None of them are excellent winning strategies. I have won with these decks. I've lost with these decks. There's never been a consistent win-loss ratio between them. They're just decks that I built to have fun with. Uh, for so so um, so for this, I'll be introducing you to one of my first decks I actually ever built, and that I've been constantly improving on since I first built it. Um, this deck actually comes from the early days of Commander, and for those of you who don't know what Commander is, it's a format for the card game Magic the Gathering, in which you have in which you pick one legendary creature card to be your commander, and then you build a deck around that commander's colors and abilities. At least that's the general idea. Some people build around ability. I mean, you're always restricted by color, but some people just build it for color, and others build for just ability, but are restricted by that color. For instance, if the commander you chose is red and black, then the cards in your deck have to be red or black, or at least have or colorless. And if they have, and if there are some exceptions, as in some cards may be black but have a green mana symbol in their ability type. This card, for color identification purposes, is considered black and green, which means you couldn't put it in a commander that was black and red. Aside from your commander, your deck consists of 99 other cards. This includes creatures, non-creature spells, and lands. Um, Both the creatures and non-creature spells have to fall within your commander's color, so they have to be the colors of your commander. As for mentioned, if you have a red and green, red and black commander, then the cards you can have are either red and black. Colorless cards are okay so long as they do not contain any mana symbols that don't match the the colors of your commander. Such as a colorless card have an ability that requires a green mana symbol, green mana to activate, or a colorless card, like say one of the signets, that taps and produces a color that isn't the same color as your commander. As for lands, lands also have to match your color commander. Your basic lands have to be the colors of your commander, and the non-basic lands either have to produce colorless, have an ability that doesn't have a colored mana symbol in it, or produce mana that is the same color as your commander. Um, and in this first deck I'll show you, you'll actually see some examples of this. Um, uh, what else? Oh yes. If your commander and how you identify commander is by the mana symbols on the top corner of the. How you identify your commander's color is by the mana symbols in the top corner of your commander. For instance, this will not be a legendary creature because I don't have. Because actually, I'll just show you. I'll actually show you with the commander that I am using. It's called Ghave Guru Spores. Let's see if we can get a clearer picture without the glare. It doesn't look like it, but for Ghave, his colors are green, black, and white, and you can denote them by the color symbols in the mana cost. Now, some commanders and most cards actually have a number also in their mana cost, and this is what's known as generic mana. That means that this cost right here can be paid with any color of mana. But since the commander for this deck is Ghave, and he is considered a green, black, and white commander, all the cards that you're going to see are going to be of those colors, or at least a combination of those colors, or colorless, and work in conjunction with those colors. Now, one of the finer aspects of deck building in Commander is that every single card in your Commander deck, with the exception of basic land, is gonna be a single copy. You cannot have more than one copy of a card in your Commander deck, with the exception of basic land. And of course, this is always the exception with any deck build, because no matter what format you're playing, basic land is going to make up the bulk of your mana base. I mean, in Commander, you're more likely to encounter non-basic lands than you are basic lands, and some decks are built purely around non-basic lands. I've seen them; they're actually interesting to play against, but basic lands usually play a much larger role than most people think, especially with all the options. What makes Commander one of the most interesting formats is that there really isn't a restriction on what cards you can put in the deck. Yes, there is a ban list, but as far as how far back you can pull from Magic the Gathering, you can actually go all the way back to the beginning and pull cards from the earliest sets all the way to the most recent sets. And like I said, yes, there is a ban list, and you can always check out Wizards' official site to see what cards are banned and what cards aren't. For the most part, there are a lot of cards that aren't. Only a handful of cards are actually banned, and for various reasons. Either they break the game, or they don't work in the format, or they're just simply so valuable, that the odds of you actually seeing them are extremely, and I mean extremely rare, to the point that if anybody actually played these cards, they would be absolutely nuts to do so. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the first deck that I'm going to show you. As I said, it is Ghave the Guru Spores. Now, so what does Ghave do? So, as I said, he is a white, green, and black commander. He costs white, green, black, and two other generic mana to cost. Now, when he enters the battlefield, he comes in with 5 +1/+1 counters. If you notice down here, this is his power and this is his toughness, and they start at 0. Now, as you know, if you've been playing Magic a while, as you know, a creature with 0 toughness cannot exist on the battlefield. It instantly goes to the graveyard as soon as it hits the field if it has 0 toughness. So as soon as Ghave enters the battlefield, before he would actually have to enter the graveyard, he gets 5 1/1 +1/+1 counters on him, which would actually make him have a starting power of 5 power and a starting toughness of 5 toughness. Now, as for his abilities, you can pay 1 generic mana and remove a 1/1 counter from a creature you control to put a 1/1 green Saproling creature token into the battlefield. So that's this homie right here. That's one of these guys right here. Now this is what's known as a token creature. They don't actually go into your deck. And they're just extra cards that have to represent various things, represent various creatures that enter the battlefield that you don't actually necessarily cast, but as a result of an ability. Now, Ghave's next ability is that you can pay one and sacrifice a creature. And what sacrifice means is that you intentionally send it to the graveyard. And to do and the result of doing this, at least for Ghave's case, is that you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Now, you can do this for Ghave to refill his +1/+1 counters, or you can do this to boost other creatures as well, which is the basic crux of the deck. Now, like I said, that's the basic way this deck works, is +1/+1 counters and tokens. Now I'm going to introduce you to some of the cards that I put in this deck. I'm not going to go through every single card, but I did make a deck list on Tapped Out, and the link for that is going to be in the description below, as well as links to Wizards of the Coast, because they actually own the game, to the MTG website, and of course other various sites where you can see these cards and check out their abilities and values. I would actually like to stress that this video is not sponsored by anyone. I am not doing this for any monetary reasons. I'm doing this purely for the fun of it. If I do get picked up for a sponsorship somewhere down the line, hey, that's cool. So with Ghave and his abilities out of the way, let's introduce you to some of the cards that actually go into this deck that work with it. So I'll just put Ghave over here, and we'll actually start out with some of the land cards that actually go in here, and I'll actually show you some examples of what lands can and cannot go, what lands would be able to go in there. So two of the most essential lands in this deck that I work with in this deck are Opal Palace and Karn's Bastion. Now, Opal Palace was released in a later commander set than Ghave was. Ghave was actually one of the first commanders released when the game when the format actually got officially picked up by Wizards. Opal Palace was released in a later commander set as a common non-basic land. And what Opal Palace does is that you can tap it and add one colorless mana to your mana pool. To tap, you simply just turn it sideways. Or you can pay one and tap it to add to your mana pool one color of any color that is your commander's colors. In Ghave's case, that is, of course, the white, the green, or the black. If you spend this mana to cast your commander, it enters the battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number of times it's been cast from the command zone this game. Now, to explain that further, commanders are actually interesting because they actually sit outside the game until you can cast them. They're actually like a spare card that you have in your hand, but everybody knows that you have it. But it doesn't sit in your hand. It actually sits in its own zone called the command zone. And whenever a commander leaves the battlefield for any reason, you are given a choice. You can either send it to the zone that it was sent to. Say, if it died, you can send it to the graveyard. If it was removed from the game, you can send it to what's known as the exile pile. If it was sent back to your hand, you can return it to your hand, or if it was shuffled into your library, you can do that too. But what most people do when it comes to their commander is they send it back to the command zone. And the reason for this is that it allows for the commander to be recast without having to worry about without having to shortcut any other methods to get it back out. When it's sent back to your hand, most people when it's sent back to the hand, most people opt to send it back to the hand. Now, there's a reason for this. Each time the commander is sent to the command zone, its mana cost actually increases by 2 generic mana. And this what's known as commander tax is actually cumulative. So it is actually cumulative and exponent, and each time it costs two additional mana times the number it had already been cast. So the first cast is just its mana cost. The second time you cast it from your command zone, it will cost its mana cost plus 2 more, and then 4, and then 6, and then 8. and plus its mana cost, and so on and so forth. So on and so forth. So what Opal Palace does is that whenever you use this the colored mana to cast your commander, it'll take into account as many times as it's been cast from the command zone and add an additional +1/+1 counter. Now this really works with Ghave because he already comes out with 5, and using Opal Palace to cast him once will give him an additional one, which is 6. And if you keep doing that, it'll be 7, 8, 9, 10, so on and so forth. This gives Ghave more resources to play with for his own ability. Next, I'll introduce you to Karn's Bastion. Now, Karn's Bastion, on its own, isn't very miraculous because you tap, it adds a colorless mana, much like Opal Palace. But Karn, much like Opal's, but the Bastion, much like the Palace, actually has its own ability in which you can tap 4 mana of any kind to pay for its 4 generic ability. Tap it and do what's known as Proliferate. Now, Proliferate's not a new ability. It's actually been around since a previous set called Scars of Mirrodin. And but it has changed somewhat. What the current reading for Karn's Bastion says, for Proliferate says, is that when you proliferate, you choose any number of permanents and/or players, and then give each another counter of each kind it already had. So in the case of Ghave, you can actually give it more +1/+1 counters. Now this card is actually one of the cards I auto include in this deck simply because of the proliferate ability. 4 tap proliferate. All your creatures that have counters on them, get them. Any players that have counters on them, get those too. There's an ability called Poison that's really kind of lame in Commander, and you're probably going to disagree with me in this, but it kind of ruins the game for me. But it's essentially a counter that when a player gets so many of them, they lose the game instantly. But that number is extremely low, and in a game, and in certain games, it could really disrupt the game, force players to focus on a single player, or force players to scramble to try and do other things, or even turn people against each other. It doesn't make the game fun, at least in my opinion. Now, other lands, of course. Now, these lands aren't essential, but I'm going to show you some of them. There's things like Jungle Hollow, Temple of Silence, and Selesnya Sanctuary, to name a few. There's also Sandstep Citadel. Now, what makes these cards so important is that each of these tap for 1 or 2 of the colors of my commander. Like Jungle Hollow taps for either a black or a green. Temple of Silence taps for either a green or a white and a black. Selesnya Sanctuary actually taps for both a green and a white. So these are actually kind of cool. And then there's of course the Sandstep Citadel, which taps for either a green, white, or black. These ones you get a choice of what colors you want to produce. This one just produces those 2 colors automatically. And I have similar lands in my land pool to use. These dual and tri lands are essential to basically those who play non-basic lands. Basic lands, of course, are your swamps, your plains, and your forests. Now, typically, I run 5 of each. In 3 color, I typically run 5 of each. This of course gives my land fetches something to go for, and ensures that I at least have some form of basic land base in there. Some people go more, some people go less. I go with 5 just to make it even, just to make it good. The rest, of course, my land base is made up of non-basic lands. Now, one of the lands I want to show you, which actually works well with the proliferate mechanic, is this card. It's super old. It's called Encash and Store, and it comes into play tapped, and you can choose not to untap it during your untap phase, which means it already comes in sideways and it doesn't produce any land. Now, if you choose to do so, you can put what's known as a storage counter on it, and with Karn's Bastion and the proliferate effect, you can actually rack up these storage counters way fast. This is what's known as a storage land, and there's actually several different types out there. Some produce one color, some produce multiple colors. This one only produces one color. It produces white. So you can tap it, remove any number of storage counters from it, and add that much white mana to your mana pool. It's actually kind of cool for white mana acceleration for those who play pure white and don't really have a lot of mana acceleration options. Uh, Now another one like that is Fountain of Cho. It does basically the same thing, but the main difference is in Kanchan Shores, I know you can't see this, but like I said, all these cards will be in the deck list in the description below, so if you need an understanding of how these cards work or want to look closer at them for yourself, you can. I know my camera doesn't have the best resolution, but one of the main differences between Incantation Store and Fountain of Cho is Enchanted Shore actually shows the white mana symbol that you can produce. This means that if you were to play this in a commander deck, you can only play this in a commander that has white in its mana as one of its colors. Now Fountain of Shoal does produce white mana in the same way that Enchanted Shore does. However, it does not have a mana symbol on it, which means you could actually put this in it, which means this is actually what I call a loophole card, which means that you could actually put this in a deck that doesn't necessarily use white mana, or whose commander isn't white, and still use this land simply because it does not have a mana symbol in its ability. Um, I mean, by that time, white is still. For that, white is still just a dead. For that, white is. That makes it a dead color, and you might as well be producing colorless with it. But it still allows you to. It's still an interesting thought, if in case you ever want to do something like that. So, Enchanted Shores is, of course, from Enchanted Shores is from Fallen Empires. It's a really old card. And the same thing with Fountain Show. It's not as old. It's actually from Arcadian Masks. So in case you ever wanted to find them, that pretty much covers land for the deck. They may not be essential land, but they're fun little land to show off. Now I'm going to show off creatures, and that's only because this is a pile that's not as big. I'm going to show you some creatures. Not all of them are going to be essential to the deck. Some are just fun little pools that I have. And some really work well with the deck. So one of the first cards I'm going to show you is Ujin's Conjurant. So Ujin's Conjurant is a fairly recent card from War of the Spark. And much like Ghave Guru Spores, it starts out with a power and toughness of 0. And much like Ghave Guru Spores, it comes in with +1/+1 counters on it. Now Ujin's Conjurant is an interesting card because it has what's known as an X cost in it. And what an X cost is, it's a generic cost that you can pay anything into, even 0. And what that means, and generally the X cost goes part and parcel with the ability of the card. And in Ujin Conjurant's case, the X will come out to the number of 1/1 counters that actually comes into play with. Now, Ujin's Conjurant is interesting because if Ujin's Conjurant would be dealt damage while it has a 1/1 counter on it, you can prevent that damage or remove a 1/1 counter from Ujin's Conjurant. There have been a few cards with a similar ability. One of them I can think of is known as Unbreathing Horde. It's a zombie card. Unfortunately, the number of 1/1 counters it comes out with are equal to the number of zombies on the battlefield and in the graveyard. And it's one of the reasons why I'm not running it in this deck, because this is not a zombie deck. But Ujin's Conjuring it works really well because Ujin's Conjuring would lose those 1/1 counters, but you could always refill it with Ghave. You can always refill Ujin's Conjuring with Ghave. The same thing with this next one, Walking Ballista. Now, Walking Ballista, similar to Ujin's Conjuring, it comes in with a number of 1/1 counters equal to what you paid into its mana cost. However, unlike Ujin's Conjuring, which only has a single X, Walking Ballista has a double X, and what that means is that X will be equal to what you pay into both sides of X. So if you paid three, and three into both of those, that does not combine into 5. It actually combines into. It would actually be 3. You just have to pay more to get it out. But Walking Ballista can restore its own 1/1 counters by paying 4 generic mana, and it has an ability that if you remove a 1/1 counter from Walking Ballista, it deals 1 damage to target creature or player. This is what's known as a pinging card, and to ping means to do a minute amount of damage to something. It may not be enough to kill it, but it would be enough to weaken it. And walking and pinging cards are fun like that. There's a number of pinging cards out there, all of various colors. One of the most prevalent ones is known as Prodigal Sorcerer. He's a blue one that you tap, and he deals 1 damage to target creature or player. And much like the Conjurant, Walking Ballista can be revealed with Ghave. Um, so another card that would go another card that, and now a card that goes well with Walking Ballista and Ujin's Conjurant is Heliod the Sun Crown. Now Heliod the Sun Crown is one of the new gods from Theros Beyond Death. He's a new version of an old god called Heliod. He's indestructible, and as long as your devotion to white is less than 5, Heliod isn't a creature. Now, what devotion is devotion is equal to the number of mana symbols in your card. So, for instance, for Heliod's case, you would have all across all your permanents, you'd have to have at least 5 white mana symbols for him to become a creature. Now, one of his other abilities is whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or enchantment you control. The reason why this is because Theros Beyond Death featured a lot of enchantments that can become creatures, or a lot of creatures that were enchantments themselves. Um, just like Heliod, Heliod is an enchantment creature. He's a legendary enchantment creature. Um, which means that if someone played something that targeted enchantments, they could target Heliod. He also has an ability that if you pay 1 and a white, another target creature gains lifelink until the end of turn. With Ujin's Conjurant, this is good because he would gain a +1/+1 counter for whenever he dealt damage because you would gain life, and he would be able to refill that you'd at least be able to gain one counter back from the counters he lost when he did damage. Walking Ballista, on the other hand, is an interesting card in this way because lifelink triggers whenever a creature deals damage. It doesn't matter what type of damage it is. So in Walking Ballista's case, you give him lifelink, and as long as he still has at least a 1/1 counter on him to where he won't die, you can constantly refill him and use him. This is one of the few. This is actually what's known as an infinite combo, but it's a fairly easy one to break because if you destroy the ballista or find some way to get rid of Heliod, then the combo doesn't work. There are a myriad ways around that, and it's one of the reasons why it hasn't been banned yet. Um, now I don't typically employ infinite combos. This is just one I stumbled upon. This is just one I happened to stumble upon modifying the deck, and because of Heliod's ability, I thought it'd be cool to have lifelink, gain 1/1 counters whenever I swung. That way I don't have to rely on Gave's ability so much, but with Walking Bliss in there, it's kind of brutal. People would really work fast to kind of get rid of this combo. Um, so another another card that I put in here is Winding Constrictor. Now, Winding Constrictor comes from Aether Revolt, and it's a black-green snake creature with a power of 2 and a toughness of 3. Now, the reason why Winding Constrictor is interesting because of his ability, which basically works in conjunction with the entire deck. If one or more creatures would be placed, if one or more counters would be placed on an artifact or a creature you control, then that many of those counters plus 1 are placed on the permanent instead. Now what this means is that, say I activated Gave's ability, sacrificed a Sapperling, and put a 1/1 counter on him. Well, with Winding Constrictor out, he would instead get 2 1/1 counters. This doesn't double the 1/1 counters it gets, it just increases the number of 1/1 counters it gets by 1. So it's a nice opening card, especially for this deck. People really work hard to get rid of it because of its power and toughness. It's relatively difficult to get rid of in early game. And then its other ability is if you would get 1 or more counters, you get that many counters plus 1 instead. So, like I said, players can get counters in a myriad of ways, and actually makes Winding Constrictor a double-edged sword, especially if you're playing against infect decks, because this would actually increase the number of infect counters you get and brings you that much closer to death. But there are also a number of other counters that also work with it, and it's just a fun inclusion into Ghave. I'll actually show you what I call his big brother. He was actually released earlier than Winding Constrictor, but Winding Constrictor is a little bit more cost effective, and that's Corpse Shack Menace. He's a 4/4. He's a 4/4 black-green creature that costs 1 black, 1 green, and 2 of any other color. And his ability states, if 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be placed on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters would be placed on instead. Now, with things like Winding Constrictor, this interaction is really interesting. The way this interaction would work, of course, is say I sacrifice a Sapperling to give Ghave a +1/+1 counter. You would want Winding Constrictor to trigger first. That way he would get 2 1/1 counters instead of 1, and then you would want Corpse Shack to trigger next, because that 2 becomes 4. If you did it the other way, he would get 2 1/1 counters plus 1, so it'd be 3. And as we know, 4 is greater than 3. A lot of people work hard to get rid of this card, and it's a very inclusive card for anybody who plays 1/1 counters. I call him Winding Constrictor's big brother, but his ability is actually a little bit more limited. Winding Constrictor counts any counter given to a creature, artifact, or player, while Corpse Shack Menace only counts 1/1 counters being placed on a creature. So that's fun, and you can start to see the way the deck works, the way it synergizes. Nearly every card I have in here does something like that. Now, I'm going to introduce you to 2 creatures that actually work with the tokens that are produced. These are Verdant Force and Slimefoot the Stowaway. Now, what these cards do are very interesting. Verdant Force is an elemental creature that was first printed a while back, and has had a recent reprint in Dominaria. Slimefoot also comes from that set as well. And what Verdant Force reads is, at the beginning of your upkeep, create a 1/1 green Sapperling creature token. So that means that you can produce Sapperlings without actually having to remove 1/1 counters from Ghave. The same thing with Slimefoot. He has, if you pay 4, create a 1/1 green Sapperling creature token. Now, what makes these creatures interesting is that these three actually work in conjunction with each other, along with other cards that you'll see later in the line of this deck, and especially Slimefoot. And Slimefoot's ability is whenever a sapling you control dies. That means when it's dealt when it is sent to the graveyard. Um, then Slimefoot deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you gain 1 life. So this is interesting. So say you create a token with Verdant Force, sacrificed it with Ghave. So Slimefoot would trigger, and token. What happens to tokens is that since they're not cards you cast, and they're not creatures that actually exist in your deck, what happens to a token is that when it goes to the graveyard, it it hits the graveyard, and anything that would trigger off it hitting the graveyard would see it. And then after those effects resolve, the token itself disappears from the graveyard, which means it can't be brought back. It can't be brought back. It can't be used in any way, shape, or form after it hits the graveyard. And this is true for whenever it leaves play in general. If it's sent back to your hand, if it's exiled, it always disappears, and it cannot be manipulated from any of those zones ever again, even if it's sent back to your deck. You lose that token, and this is what makes tokens interesting. Tokens are generally low-powered things that that are often used for fuel for other things. There are some decks that actually rely heavily on tokens and can produce bigger tokens or make tokens bigger. I actually have a couple of them myself. In this case, tokens are generally used to feed, or basically what I call feed my cards, and that's basically they're used for sacrifice fodder to activate abilities within the deck. And Slimefoot really works well, especially with the sapling production, because he'll hurt opponents. He'll hurt opponents for the loss of saplings and gain you life. He actually is really good for longevity. And Verdant Force is actually a powerful creature in its own right, but also gives you saplings during each upkeep, not just your own, but during each upkeep. That means all your opponents. And if you're playing a full game of Commander, which is generally 4 players, that's 4 saplings every turn rotation. You get 1 on your upkeep. You get 1 on your first opponent's upkeep, second opponent's upkeep, third opponent's upkeep, and when it comes back around to you, you have another one. So those are really cool. To work into your deck. At least I do. So if you're worried about a mana base, there's also this guy, Rishka Pima Renegade. Rishkar's ability states that whenever he enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. That means that, say you have Ghave and Rishka out, you can play him, and Ghave can get a 1/1 counter, and Rishkar can get a 1/1 counter. Or any way, shape, or form. And once again, with things like Corpshack Menace and things with Corpshack Menace and Winding Constrictor, those counters will also get increased. Now, for each creature that has a counter on it, and that's any counter, not just +1/+1 counters, they can be tapped to add green mana. They essentially become what is known as a Llanowar Elf, or for the more casual players, what's known as a Mana Dork. Mana Dorks are creatures that you tap to produce mana with. One of the most commons, of course, is the Llanowar Elf, but there's also things like Birds of Paradise, Golden Goose, so on and so forth. So Rishkar's fun in that aspect. For mana acceleration, so one of the funner cards in this deck that I like. The same thing with so if you're also looking for other mana accelerants, there's also Fertilid. And what Fertilid comes in the battlefield with 2 1/1 counters, and you can pay 1 and agree to remove a 1/1 counter from Fertilid and search your library for a basic land card and put that land in the battlefield tapped. So, and this ability can be activated, and then you shuffle your library. and actually it's and it's target players, so you can also help out. You can also help out people who are kind of getting land screwed. Um, it's really great for group huggy decks, or helping or building political favors. Because Commander is a really political game. You can go, hey, I noticed that you're doing kind of short on land. I can actually help you get land if you don't do something really horrible to me, and it often works. And of course, with all the other abilities, you can constantly refill his 1/1 counter his 1/1 counters. Um, then then of course we have so then I'm going to show you a couple like this Spark Reaper and Yahenni, which are really good, which are known as sack outlets. And Spark Reaper, you tap three, you sacrifice a creature or planeswalker, and you gain a life and draw a card, which is really good because you can sacrifice the sapperling, gain a life, draw a card. That's good if you need cards in your hand, if you're running low on life. And then there's Yahenni Undying Partisan. And what he does is he's a 2/2 with haste. And whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you put a 1/1 counter on Yahenni. And then you can sacrifice another creature to make Yahenni indestructible. This is good in case someone wants to blow Yahenni up or whatever. You can sacrifice another creature. Yahenni is indestructible. And then and so that works. And then I'll show you something that really works with this deck. That's Butcher of Malakir. Now, what Butcher of Malakir does is he's a 5/4 flyer, and whenever Butcher of Malakir or another creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. And that really works with something like Yahenni Undying Partisan. You sack a creature to Yahenni to make it indestructible, or Ghave to give it a 1/1 counter, and then because that creature died, your opponents each have to sacrifice a creature, and then Yahenni will get more 1/1 counters because of that. Or it also helps just sack a whole bunch of creatures, wipe your opponent's boards. So let's get to some of the more rando cards in this deck that seem weird inclusions but actually work. One of them is Puppeteer Click. Now, Puppeteer Click is a 3/2 flying creature that says when Puppeteer Click enters the battlefield, put target creature card from an opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It gains haste at the beginning of your next end step, exile it. So with Puppeteer Click for a turn, you could actually rummage through your opponent's graveyards and get some of their more powerful creatures that had been killed earlier. Now, Puppeteer Click also has an ability called Persist. And what Persist does is that when Puppeteer Click dies, if it didn't have a neg1 counter on it, it would return to the battlefield with a neg1 counter, which would mean it would come back even weaker. So in this case, it would come back from a 3/2 to a 2/1. Now, that's not really a big problem, especially in a deck like this, because 1/1 counters and neg1 counters cancel each other out. So if a creature has a neg1 counter on it, and you put a +1/+1 counter on it, both those counters disappear. Thus removing Puppeteer Click, or thus allowing you to reuse Puppeteer Click more. So the only so say you sacrifice so this is good. Say you sacrifice Puppeteer Click to Yahenni. It didn't have a 1/1 counter. It comes back with a neg1 counter. Yahenni gets stronger. Butcher Malakir triggers. It kills something at the same time. Now you can't steal the creature that Butcher Malakir forces the opponents to sacrifice, because they see each other enter the graveyard at the same time, and they weren't technically in the graveyard at the time of Puppeteer Click entering the graveyard. So they all go, and then Puppeteer Click enters the battlefield. So because those cards are actually in the graveyard, I need to correct myself. I'm sorry. I kind of got ahead of myself. Because Puppeteer Click, so don't leave any angry comments saying, no, you're wrong, this is actually how it works. because Puppeteer Click returns to the battlefield and the cards that your opponent sacrifice are in the graveyard, Puppeteer Click sees those cards, and you can take those cards. You can take one of those cards and put it into the battlefield, and you can repeat this process too. And this is a repeatable process thanks to cards that put 1/1 counters on Puppeteer Click. So it's actually so that actually works really well. Now I'm going to show you a couple cards in here that don't seem like they seem like odd inclusions, but they're actually really great. One of them is Spiritmonger. Now Spiritmonger is a 6/6 creature, is a 6/6 beast creature with that costs 3 black and green, and it has an ability that says whenever Spiritmonger deals damage to a creature, put a 1/1 counter on Spiritmonger. So he gets 1/1 counters. He gives himself 1/1 counters whenever he damages a creature. It makes him an excellent blocker because he gets stronger every time he deals damage to a creature, and it doesn't have to kill the creature either. He'll get the 1/1 counters if he deals the damage. Spiritmonger will. You can also tap a black to regenerate Spiritmonger, and what regenerate does is it will tap the creature and remove it from combat. This will save Spiritmonger from being destroyed unless otherwise stated that it can't be regenerated. Its next ability is you tap green and Spiritmonger becomes a color of your choice until the end of turn. Now, what makes that second ability interesting is, say your opponent has this really big mean creature, and Spiritmonger can kill it. But unfortunately, it has protection from black or green. Well, with Spiritmonger, that's not a problem because you can tap the green, you can tap a green mana, and now Spiritmonger is white or blue or red. And that protection doesn't mean anything because these colors don't mean anything either. And because both his abilities and his initial mana cost and if you're worried about color type matching with your commander, don't, because that only matters for the initial mana cost and the ability cost itself. If the creature changes color mid game, that does not exclude it would not exclude him from being added into your deck initially anyway. So he's kind of fun. He's a nice powerhouse. And another fun one is Vulturous Zombie. So Vulturous Zombie is a 3/3 flyer with that costs the same as Spiritmonger, 3 black and green. And his ability states, whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, put a 1/1 counter on Vulturous Zombie. And from anywhere, that means from the hand, from the deck, from the field. If your opponent is forced to discard something, Vulturous Zombie gets a 1/1 counter. If your opponent is forced to mill, that is to take the top X cards from the top of their graveyard and put them into, or from the top of their deck and put them in the graveyard, Vulture Zombie will get a 1/1 counter. If a creature dies on the battlefield, or is even countered, or if a card is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, either by the result of it being cast, countered, or even killed, or if in the case of a creature being killed while on the battlefield, Vulture Zombie gets a 1/1 counter. It is a fun card to have, and flying is and the fact that it flies is even greater. There's not enough flying. I don't have enough flying in this deck, and the fact that I have a flyer is really awesome. So that pretty much sums up creatures. I have a whole bunch of other creatures that I could show you, but the video is kind of running long as it is, and you guys have been here. A while, so I'm going to go to a quick breakdown of some of the non-creature spells. So of course mana is always an issue in case of green, in the case of decks. So I'm going to show you a few cards that actually work to help you accelerate the mana. I'm going to show you a few cards that actually help you accelerate mana and help you get to where you're going, as well as actually work within the deck itself. So here's a few cards that actually work with the deck itself, and will get you mana. First up is Leyline of Abundance. Now, Leylines are actually really cool because they have an ability that states that if it's in your hand at the beginning of the game, you could actually start the game with it on the battlefield. And Leyline of Abundance is actually one of the best cards there is because it's mana, and mana is always essential. And then what its initial ability says is that whenever you tap a creature for mana, 80 mana, you get to add an additional green to that mana. So, like I showed you before with Rishkar, that gives you even more mana. That gives you mana to play with. You can also tap 6. You can also tap 6 and 2 green to put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. Now that's a little bit more of a late game thing, but it actually is really fun. Now, Leyline of Abundance actually works with this planeswalker right here, Jiang Yang Wildcrafter. Now, in recent sets with War, especially with War of the Spark, they released planeswalkers that had what are known as static abilities. These are abilities that you don't have to pay for and that are always active. In Jiang Yingyu's case, it's each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter has tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Given the way this deck works, that is actually a really cool ability. Put a 1/1 counter on something, even your commander. Play your commander, it already comes with 1/1 counters, have Jiang Yingyu out, bam, mana dork. Bam, you have a mana dork. You have a mana dork to get more mana with. And, of course, with Leyline Abundance, when you do that, you actually get an additional green mana on top of the color that you produce. So that's cool. Of course, next I'll actually show you. Next is, of course, essential. What are essential for any commander decks, a mana rock. And what a mana rock is, it's an artifact that taps and that produces mana. In my case, I'm showing you Orzhov's Signet. Now, there's about 10 of these signets out there. There's actually several signets out there and several different mana rocks out there. I'm choosing to show you Orzhov's Signet, which you tap one and you tap it and it produces a white and a black. Now, there are different, like I said, there are different mana rocks out there and they all produce different types of mana. They all produce different types of mana. But this is actually an auto include in some cases. In this case, because white and black doesn't have a lot of mana acceleration. Black has it more than white does. White not so much, and white is actually one of the weakest colors in Commander right now. Because of it. The next one I'm going to show you is Zendikar Resurgent. It's an enchantment that costs 5 and 2 green. Of course, with all the mana that you're producing, it's a late game thing, but it's still fun to play. And it says that whenever you tap a land for mana, add 1 mana to your mana pool of any type that land produces. So, which means you can double your mana, and in terms of dual lands and tri-lands, you can actually get an additional mana of the land that it can produce. So, like say for instance, like I showed you, say for instance, like Jungle Hollow. So you tap Jungle Hollow for a black. With Zendikar Resurgent out, you can actually gain both the black and the green together, and it's fun. And its second ability is whenever you cast a creature spell, you can draw a card. So that gives you card draw as well as additional mana. Next, I'm going to show you a couple of quick spells. Kadama's Reach and Primal Growth. Both of these go and fetch lands from your deck. Kadama's Reach says search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal those cards, and put one in your hand, one in the battlefield tapped, and the other into your hand. Then shuffle your library. This is really cool in case you didn't play a land for the turn. So you cast it. Say you go get a Plains, that will be the land that you put into the battlefield, so that's tapped. And then you go get a Swamp, that will go in your hand. And if you didn't play a land that turn, you can play the Swamp you just got. And that will come into play untapped. So it's good. So it's good mana acceleration. I see it played a lot in Commander, especially in any deck. Naturally, any deck that plays green. Next is Primal Growth. Now, Primal Growth actually works with this deck because of this ability right here. This ability is what's known as Kicker, and several spells intermittently throughout Magic's history have what's known as a Kicker cost. And a Kicker cost is an optional cost that you can pay on top of a card's normal mana cost to get an extra effect. For Primal Growth, it requires you to sacrifice a creature. And as you've seen in this deck, that is not necessarily a problem. You can sacrifice a token, bam, bam, kicker cost paid. And with Primal Growth, you can search your library for a land card, put that land in the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Or a basic land card, not a land card, a basic land card. And then, if you kick the card, instead search your library for 2 basic land cards and put them into the battlefield. Put them into play. Now these lands don't come into play tapped, so that's actually really good. That's actually really good. And it's a common card. It costs 2 in green, and it's really cheap. It should be easy to go get a hold of from like TCG Player or anywhere else that you shop online for cards, Card Kingdom, eBay, wherever. Once again, I'd like to stress that this video is not sponsored. I'm just naming these places to give you an idea of where you want to go, and some of the links for this will be below. I mean, hey, it's good for them. It's notoriety. It's business. If they want to come and shut me down, I'll be all like, give me a sponsorship, and I'll talk about your site all day. So next is Perilous Forays. Now this card came out in the first Ravnica set, Ravnica City of Guilds. It costs 3 and 2 green, and it's an uncommon card. And what it says is that you can tap one, sacrifice a creature, and search your library for a land card, and put it with a basic land type, and put it in the battlefield tapped, and shuffle your library. Now this is a really good land grab. Now this is a really good land grab for this deck because like you can sacrifice the tokens, get basic land. I mean, it'd be better if you can grab any land, but hey, basic land works. And there are several other cards in here that actually work with land grabbing, land acceleration, so on and so forth. But hey, you're probably wondering, hey, Toonstar, you're playing black. You're playing black and white. What about creature destruction? Well, I have that too. Cards like Vindicate, Wrath of God. Let's see. In Garrick's Wake. And of course, and Fated Retribution. Most of these are world-killing spells. I mean, Vindicate's one of my few targeted spells, and it's good because it targets a permanent, which means you can destroy anything: land, artifact, enchantment, planeswalker, creature, token. You can destroy it all, with the exception of emblems, because I don't know why. Emblems are untargetable things, and they shouldn't be. So. Of course, Wrath of God, In Garrick's Wake, Fated Retribution, they destroy creatures. These two destroy planeswalkers. This one, if it's my turn, this one does it for things I don't control. This one, if it's my turn, I get to scry. So yeah, there's a lot of I still play into the black, and of course with things like Butcher, Malakir, I have if I sacrifice when something of mine dies, something of theirs dies. I also have this card. It's kind of a fun card. It's called Ready and Willing. It's what's known as a split card, and split cards were introduced early on in Magic's history, and basically they are 2 cards in one. You can either play one or the other. Later on, in a set called Dragon's Maze, which was part of the second Ravnica set, you had Fuse, which means that if you had enough mana, you could play both cards as a single card. So, and this one's really good because with Ready, creatures you control are indestructible indestructible this turn, and you can untap those creatures, which gives you a chance to swing or block. And then with Willing, creatures you control gain Death Touch and Lifelink until the end of turn. This is good for really defending yourself because your creatures become indestructible, so you can block, and you untap them, so you have ready blockers. So you have ready blockers in case someone comes and swings at you, and Willing gives them Lifelink and Death Touch, so you block. Your creatures are indestructible. They deal damage. You gain life, and with Death Touch, they deal that damage and die, and your opponent's creatures die just by simply dealing damage. It doesn't even have to be enough damage to kill them. So you can do this with a bunch of your little tokens that you produce, block with those tokens, and kill their creatures. It's fun. It's fun. It's a nice way of doing things, and it really throws your opponents for a loop, especially the fusion. Now, of course, let's talk about this card, Primal Vigor. Primal Vigor, it may not be doubling season because doubling season is expensive and I can't afford it, but Primal Vigor is a nice second. And what Primal Vigor reads, if one or more tokens we put into the battlefield, twice that many tokens are put into the battlefield instead, and if one or more +1/+1 counters will be placed on a creature, twice that many 1/1 counters are placed on that creature instead. So the difference between this and Doubling Season is Doubling Season only works for you, while Primal Vigor works for everybody. Like I said, it's a nice close second along with this next card I'm going to show you. And it is called Contagion Clasp. Now, Contagion Clasp was introduced in Scars of Mirrodin along with Infect. Now, what Infect does, you hear me talk about a lot, but I really haven't explained it and why I think it's really bad, and I'll save most of that for another video. But Infect, essentially, what Infect is when a creature with Infect swings, if it deals damage to a creature, that creature gets that many -1/-1 counters, and if it deals damage to a player, that player gets that many poison counters. So what Contagion Class does is that when it enters the battlefield, you put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. And then you can tap 4 and tap and proliferate. Same thing with, it's basically an artifact version of Karn's Bastion, except that it doesn't produce land and instead puts a -1/-1 counter on a creature. Now, there's a big brother version of this called Contagion Agent, and it does the same thing except that it proliferates twice. And I'd rather have that, but it's really expensive, and Contagion Class was readily available. So that's good for your proliferation. Now I got a whole bunch of other cards in here that I would like to show you, but I really can't because because more or less they all do the same thing. I can show you this one. And that's Cathar's Crusade, and it essentially doubles the number of 1/1 counters put onto a creature, and of course there's Anointed Procession. Actually, what Cathar's Crusade does is that it doesn't double. It actually, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. That includes the creature that just came out. So that's cool. And Anointed Procession doubles the amount of tokens that you produce. So you put a token onto the battlefield. Anointed Procession sees it, and you get twice that many tokens as well. Well. So it's a nice. So those are nice, fun cards. Like I said, there's so many cards in here I want to show you, but I don't want to take up the entire video. Just know that a lot of these cards are fun. You can check out the deck list below, like I said, to get a better grasp on everything I run. So I'm basically going to wrap it up here. So like I said, this deck I've had since the very beginning, and I've added to it, I've taken away from it. For me, it's one of the funnest decks I play. There's a lot of math involved, especially if you're allowed to get going too far. What do you guys think? Do you think it's a good deck? Do you guys don't think it's a good deck? What would you do? What would you do differently? Tell me in the comments below. Oh, and remember to be kind with them. I'm not saying I can't take criticism or you're gonna hurt my feelings or anything, but saying something is stupid without actually saying why it's stupid, isn't going to help anybody. And just saying that I'm dumb for having this card, that's not nice. Don't be mean. Anyway, I'll see you guys later, and you all have a good one.